D&D is about being a game first and a story second. Fight me. Okay, so obviously I'm not trying to underplay the point of story in D&D, and this video isn't even really about game versus story. What this is really about is about tension and design, although I do stand by the statement, but really what it comes down to is that in D&D, the most important thing is player decisions and tension, and the nature of that tension and how you make that tension unfold, and story can be a part of that. It can be a huge part of it, but at the end of the day, the thing that you are most concerned by is player experience, and player experience is driven by player decisions. So, D&D is a game first. But before we get into tension and gameplay and stuff, I just want to say thanks to everybody who did a comment. It really helps a lot to have those because it really makes me not feel like I'm just shouting into the void with these. It's pretty great. And when you're sitting in your room just like staring at a camera and talking to nobody, it helps a lot to get that feedback, to be like, oh, there's human beings who listen to this and watch these and get some value out of them. So thanks again for all that. Do it more. Also likes and stuff like that. So gameplay tension, and D&D is all about gameplay tension. That's the whole point of everything. Anytime you do a story element, like imagine how annoyed people are by like being railroaded or like these moments when players undergo this weird cutscene where the DM is just like, here's what you do for 10 minutes. And the player's like, I don't want to do any of this. Like those kinds of things happen and they're really frustrating. And that I think does a lot to illustrate the point that D&D is really about being a game first and a story second, because those can be the best narrated, the best written sequences in the universe. They're still kind of awkward and boring 90% of the time. And what's worse is they don't actually do anything to contextualize the rest of the game, which means that they don't really have a meaningful impact on the gameplay experience as a whole, which to me makes them relatively superficial experiences. And the tool that you have for managing D&D as a game is tension. Now, tension basically is a goal that the players have, and then obstacles that get put in the way of that goal, and then the things that the player does in order to overcome those obstacles in order to achieve that goal is what generates the gameplay. Think of players as kind of like flowing water, where if you have water, it flows. It's not a thing that you did or that they do or that you generate or create. It's just sort of a force of nature and you let it go. Because what players do, that's sort of a force of nature that you can just completely rely on, is that a player will always attempt to alleviate tension. Always. Sometimes the way that the player alleviates tension is by not playing that game anymore. And you need to be very careful that your tension doesn't cause a situation where that is the most viable method of alleviating the tension. But that goes all the way down into the rest of the elements of the game too. It goes all the way down into the DNA of the game that you're running. Because if you think about it, an example of like, well, what if your players are being constantly punished for killing things? If the players are constantly getting punished for killing things, they're going to eventually probably just start killing everything. And that's how you make murder hobos. And you can do that in ways that are not so obvious. You can do that in ways that you don't think about it and you don't realize that what you're doing is incentivizing that, because what you were trying to do is create tension, is create gameplay decisions. But because you're not being very careful about the nature of the tension that you're creating, you accidentally create a tension that you aren't trying to build. You inadvertently create a different tension. This is effectively what emergent gameplay is tensions that unfold that you didn't anticipate. But a lot of this so far is either really heady and abstract or really obvious. So let me give you an example of kind of what I mean. Let's say you are playing a pacifist monk. Like, let's say you're playing this character and the monk is all about non-lethality all the time. So if you're playing this monk, you've got this goal of accomplishing everything through non-lethal means. You don't want to kill anybody. You probably don't really want to hurt anybody that much, but that's more acceptable. But you have a really strong goal of no killing. Well, let's now take that monk and put it in the context where the DM is accidentally punishing you for killing people all the time. And the way that this would probably most likely come about is you go fight somebody. The somebody is pretty bad. Maybe you're fighting thieves or something, and you go to fight them, you don't kill them, they get away, and then you learn later that those thieves went and murdered somebody. Well, you've just been punished for not killing somebody. Now, in certain circumstances, that might be an interesting tension. But if your goal is to be non-lethal, and that's one of your main goals, then what you have is a situation where you've your DM has inadvertently created a tension between your goal as a player of I want to not kill things and the game's goals, which is I'm going to punish you for not killing things, because the game is accidentally communicating to you, you need to deal with these things in a more permanent method, and murder is really the best method for that. But by setting these things in opposition, where the game is saying, hey, murder things, and you're saying my goal is to not murder things, you've created a contradiction. The problem is that as the player, you're responsible for half of that tension. And that half is the goal of not killing things, because attention, remember, is goals and obstacles. So the game is creating obstacles, but you as the player, you're responsible for generating the goal, because that's its origin, is your player goal. Well, okay, that's all fine, but if you're responsible for half of the tension, and as a player, you're going to be attempting to alleviate the tension because that's what players do always, well, eventually, you are slowly, as you get that feedback from the game of, hey, you should really just kill things, your only recourse for alleviating tension, and this is going to happen whether you're aware of it or not as a player, and as a player, you have the luxury of doing things subconsciously, whereas a DM, you don't. But as a player, in order to alleviate that tension, you're slowly just going to give up on the goal of being non-lethal. Like, that's just eventually going to be where that goes, because you're going to be trying to alleviate that tension, and the best way that you have to do that is to eventually give up on that goal. And the emotion that alleviating that tension generates is resignation. And see, that's really the final point, is that the emotion that you perceive, the emotion that you experience as a player, and this is the core of the player experience, is that emotion is generated by the tension. So in the example that I gave, you can see how by setting up this weird tension between your player goal and the game's obstacles, where non-lethality is just constantly causing more and more problems, then the tension that creates is then being alleviated by you, the player, and in the process of alleviating that tension, you generate the emotion of resignation. So this is a great way to talk about games, because there's a lot of debate about whether game design is like objective or subjective, is art subjective, all that stuff. But the problem with a lot of the arguments for games being objective that I see is that the conclusions ultimately end up being this game is objectively good or bad, but good or bad are already qualitative ways of thinking about things, so that's not useful. But this idea of what is the tension that I'm creating is a really, really good framing device, and it makes objectivity happen, because now you can say, if I do this and this, if I create this goal and these obstacles, then this is the tension that will unfold, and in that tension unfolding, this will be the emotion that is expressed as a result of that. And then you can say, and here's how I'll make the player have that goal, and here's how I'll make these obstacles, and here's how the tension will play out. You can make predictive analyses, in effect. You can look at your designs before they're ever put into place for the first time and try to anticipate how those things are going to interact with one another. And you can be objectively correct or incorrect because you're making highly specific, highly predictive statements. So as a DM or as a game designer in general, you want to be really clear about what tension you're building in your game, because the tension really is the core of everything. It's what the emotion comes from, and it's how all of the decisions are contextualized. It's not enough to say, well, we've got tension here, so we should be good. It's not enough to simply create tension. You need to have a really good understanding of the nature of that tension and how it's going to play out. And as I've said before, remember that when you're building things or making decisions, think of D&D as a game first, and look at it in terms of wanting to create player decisions that effectively express the tension that you're trying to build, which is going to generate the emotion that you're after, and that's the player experience. Whereas what most people do is they try to put together stories and mechanics that express a theme, which doesn't work nearly as well, because if you mess up the tensions, if you create tensions that you didn't mean to create, if you create tensions that contradict, or whereby alleviating that tension causes the player to go do something that isn't that game, or to zone out, or to not care anymore, then all of the great writing that you have for your game is irrelevant now, because you're thinking about it too much like a story. It's not a novel, it's a game, and it's a game first. And in order to be successful at designing your game, you need to have a really good understanding of what the tensions of that game are and what emotions are to be generated by it. So that's it. That's it for me today. Video is a little bit late today, this week. Sorry about that. Next time, hopefully it won't be. All right. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe, all those things. You can also recommend video topics or ask questions, and I can make videos on those. That would be awesome. That's all I've got. Okay, see you, bye. Okay, bye.